We almost lost the foundation of modern science and philosophy. A world without the scientific revolution was a genuine possibility, saved only by the quiet work of medieval translators. These hidden networks of multilingual scholars were the unsung heroes who rescued global knowledge, operating in the shadows of empires and behind monastery walls. They did far more than convert words. They transferred entire systems of thought across continents and centuries. By the end of this, you will understand how these secret collaborations built the intellectual bedrock of our modern world. We will uncover how a single book could travel from India to Spain, and why a scholar in Baghdad held the key to reviving European learning. What does it take to keep an entire civilization's knowledge from vanishing forever by the 9th century? A new intellectual superpower had emerged in the East. The city of Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, was a dazzling metropolis, a crossroads of the world where merchants, scientists, and philosophers exchanged goods and ideas. At its heart stood the legendary House of Wisdom. This was far more than a simple library. It was a massive, state-funded engine for translation, a deliberate project to capture the world's knowledge. Caliphs like Al-Mamun poured vast resources into this mission, sending emissaries far and wide to acquire precious manuscripts. They sought out texts in Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac, bringing them back to Baghdad to be translated into Arabic. This is where our hidden network of translators became a formal, powerful force. It was no longer just scattered individuals working in isolation. This was a centralized, systematic operation on an unprecedented scale. The process itself was meticulous. A leading scholar like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a master of multiple languages, would often lead a team. They did not translate directly from Greek to Arabic. Instead, to ensure absolute accuracy, they would first render the complex Greek philosophical and scientific terms into Syriac, a language they knew intimately. Once the concepts were perfectly understood and refined in Syriac, they were then translated into a clear and nuanced Arabic. This two-step process guaranteed that the depth of the original thought was preserved, not just the words. The House of Wisdom was not merely a preservation vault. It was a vibrant intellectual kitchen where different traditions were stirred together to create entirely new recipes for thought. Greek logic was merged with Indian mathematics and Persian astronomy. This synthesis created a new, enriched body of knowledge, a hybrid vigor for the medieval mind. The systematic model perfected in Baghdad, this blueprint for gathering and transforming global knowledge, would not stay within its walls. It was about to be packaged up and sent on a journey, creating ripples that would eventually reach a struggling and fragmented Europe. While the House of Wisdom provided the stage, the true stars of this intellectual transfer were the Syriac-speaking Christian scholars. Their communities, scattered across the Middle East, formed a resilient and deeply knowledgeable network. These were not just translators, they were cultural and scientific diplomats operating at the frontier of empires. For generations, families like that of Hunayn ibn Ishaq mastered the art of translation, treating it as a sacred craft passed from parent to child. Their secret weapon was the Syriac language itself. As the liturgical tongue of their churches, it was a living language of scholarship that shared deep grammatical and conceptual roots with both Greek and Arabic. This made it the perfect intermediary, a linguistic bridge capable of bearing the heavy weight of complex ideas without them collapsing into nonsense. Their work was not a simple matter of swapping words from one language to another. It was an act of deep interpretation. Take the monumental task of translating the medical texts of Galen or the logical works of Aristotle. A scholar like Hunayn would first achieve a near-philosophical mastery of the original Greek. He would then labor to express these intricate concepts in the Syriac he knew so intimately, testing each term for accuracy and nuance. Only when the ideas shone clearly in Syriac would they be rendered into elegant, precise Arabic. This multi-step process ensured that the soul of the text, its logical structure and foundational arguments, was preserved intact. It was not just language being translated, it was entire frameworks of thought. This behind-the-scenes work by a specific, skilled community ensured the flame of Greek learning was not merely kept alive as a museum piece. It was carefully tended, its fuel replenished and made ready for a new era. Their unique linguistic assets made them indispensable to the entire knowledge project. The survival of this intellectual treasure now depended on its next great migration, a journey that would carry it across the Mediterranean into an unexpected new home. As Baghdad's political power waned, the torch of translation did not sputter out. It was carried westward across North Africa and ignited a new intellectual beacon in the brilliant cities of Al-Andalus. This was Islamic Spain, a place and time that defies simple categorization. From the 10th to the 12th centuries, cities like Córdoba, Toledo, and Seville became dazzling oases of knowledge. Here, under Muslim rule, a unique society flourished where scholars from three major faiths, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, did not merely tolerate each other. They actively collaborated, creating a multicultural engine for intellectual progress that was unprecedented in medieval Europe. This was the next great adaptation of our hidden network, proving its resilience was not tied to a single empire or capital. The model perfected in Baghdad was now transplanted into a different social soil, and it thrived in remarkable new ways. In cities like Toledo, after it was conquered by Christian kings, the translation activity became even more formalized. Archbishop Raymond established a famous school where teams of scholars worked systematically. A typical team might include a Jewish scholar who translated the Arabic text into the local Romance vernacular, a Christian scholar who then rendered that vernacular into Latin, and a Muslim scholar who consulted on the original Arabic nuances. This was translation as a collaborative, assembly line process designed for maximum efficiency and accuracy. One of the pivotal figures in this environment was Abraham ibn Ezra, a Jewish polymath who traveled tirelessly between Al-Andalus, North Africa, and Italy. His work was crucial in translating sophisticated Arabic astronomical and mathematical concepts into Hebrew, which then became a new bridge language for European scholars. The types of texts being translated in Al-Andalus also expanded dramatically. It was no longer just the foundational works of Aristotle and Plato. Now, the focus included vibrant Arabic innovations. Scholars translated Al-Khwarizmi's revolutionary books on algebra, a term derived from the Arabic word al-jabr. They brought over advanced texts on trigonometry and the astrolabe. They worked on richly detailed Arabic works covering practical botany, innovative irrigation techniques, and new agricultural methods that would transform European farming. This was not just about preserving old knowledge. It was about transferring a living, growing scientific tradition. The success in Spain demonstrated a profound truth about the network of translators. It was not a fragile flower that could only bloom in one specific garden. Its strength was its adaptability, its ability to find a new home and integrate local talent, creating a fusion of intellects that ensured the continuous flow of knowledge. This multicultural oasis in Spain was diligently packaging the world's knowledge into a new container, the Latin language, preparing it for the final leg of its long journey. The treasure was now meticulously repacked and waiting at the edge of Europe, ready for its next great awakening. these translators were not stationary scribes tucked away in quiet libraries. They were intrepid travelers, the original digital nomads of the medieval world, except their data was parchment and their network was built on foot, ship, and camel. Their journeys were the physical arteries through which the lifeblood of knowledge flowed. Consider the remarkable path of a scholar like Constantine the African. He was a North African Muslim who traveled to Italy in the 11th century, carrying with him a treasure trove of medical texts, including the works of the famed physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Constantine did not just bring books, he brought an entire medical system. Upon his arrival, he entered the monastery of Monte Cassino, converted to Christianity, and dedicated his life to translating these Arabic medical compendia into Latin. His motivations were a complex mix of intellectual hunger, the search for a stable patron, and perhaps a deep, personal spiritual quest. His journey was perilous, crossing political and religious frontiers where a lone traveler with precious manuscripts was vulnerable to bandits, harsh weather, and the suspicions of local authorities. This was not an isolated incident. A whole class of scholarly migrants created knowledge routes that ran parallel to the Silk Road. On these paths, books and ideas were the most valuable commodities, more precious than spices or silk because they held the power to transform civilizations. When a scholar like Constantine arrived at his destination, he did not simply drop off a text and move on. He became a living library, a teacher who imported not just words but entire methodologies. He brought with him the interpretive framework of Arabic medicine, its diagnostic techniques, its pharmaceutical knowledge, and its entire approach to the human body. This was knowledge that had been synthesized from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources, and he was now embedding it directly into the heart of European monastic medicine. The challenge was not just the physical journey, it was the intellectual struggle to find a receptive audience, to convince powerful patrons of the value of this foreign knowledge, and to carefully navigate the religious and cultural sensitivities of a new home. Their mobility was the lifeblood of the entire network. This constant movement of people ensured that knowledge was never allowed to become static or stale in one place. It was constantly being tested, challenged, and enriched as it was carried from Baghdad to Córdoba, from Cairo to Cologne, creating dynamic and unexpected connections between the great centers of learning. The work of these traveling scholars ensured that the torch of knowledge was not just passed along, but that its flame was fanned brighter with every new hand that carried it. While the traveling scholars were the arteries, the monasteries of Europe became the beating heart. Within the cold, stone walls of a place like Monte Cassino, the day began not with commerce or court intrigue, but with prayer and the soft scratch of a quill. Here in the Scriptorium, a monk's labor was a form of worship. Every carefully drawn letter on a fresh sheet of parchment was a devotional act, a physical offering to God. This environment stood in stark contrast to the bustling, state-funded House of Wisdom. In Baghdad, the drive was often imperial ambition and a hunger for practical, worldly knowledge. In the monastic Scriptorium, the primary fuel was piety, a deep-seated belief that preserving wisdom, even wisdom from pagan or foreign sources, was a way to understand the divine order of creation. This quiet, disciplined devotion provided a completely different, yet equally vital, kind of energy for the network. It offered stability and longevity. An empire could rise and fall in a century, but a monastery could preserve a library for 1,000 years. Into these quiet hubs of devotion came men like Gerard of Cremona, a scholar driven by an insatiable curiosity that led him from Italy to the multicultural frontier of Toledo. He was not content with the limited Latin texts available in Europe. He learned Arabic specifically to access the scientific treasures he knew were held in the city's libraries. Gerard did not just visit, he immersed himself, and when he returned, he brought back not souvenirs, but an entire intellectual harvest. His life's work became the translation of these Arabic texts into Latin, and it was within the supportive, patient environment of monastic communities that this work found a secure home. The translation process itself was a meticulous, almost ritualized collaboration. In a typical scriptorium team, one monk, fluent in Arabic, would slowly read the original text aloud, translating it phrase by phrase into the common spoken vernacular. Another monk, a master of formal Latin, would then listen and transcribe those ideas into the elegant, structured prose of the scholar. This was not a solitary act, but a chorus of intellects, ensuring that the final Latin version was both accurate to the original and stylistically polished for its new audience. Think of these monasteries as the ultimate receiving stations and distribution hubs. They took in the raw, translated knowledge that had traveled from Baghdad to Córdoba to Toledo, and they began the work of carefully copying and integrating it into the European intellectual bloodstream. A single manuscript translated by a traveler like Gerard could be copied a dozen times in one monastery, and those copies would then be sent to other monasteries, creating a web of distribution that spanned the continent. This monastic system provided the durable, long-term infrastructure the entire network desperately needed in the West. The knowledge was safe, but a critical question remained. How would this carefully preserved, sacredly copied information break free from the monastery walls and ignite the minds of a wider world? The quiet hum of the scriptorium was about to be overwhelmed by a roar of intellectual activity. In the 12th century, the patient work of centuries suddenly accelerated into a great translation movement, a cultural explosion that would later be called the 12th century Renaissance. The epicenter of this quake was the city of Toledo, recently reconquered by Christian kings. It became something unprecedented, a translation factory operating on an industrial scale. This was the moment the hidden networks went into overdrive, systematically pumping the vast corpus of Greco-Arabic knowledge directly into the veins of Europe. The key figure organizing this effort was Archbishop Raymond, a visionary patron who established a formal school dedicated entirely to the art of translation. He assembled teams of the best minds from different faiths and languages, creating a collaborative machine for converting knowledge. The star of this operation was a man named Gerard of Cremona. Driven by a legendary desire to get his hands on Ptolemy's Almagest, a masterpiece of astronomy he knew was unavailable in Latin, he traveled from Italy to Toledo. He did not just find one book, he found a library of treasures. Gerard dedicated his entire life to the task, ultimately translating over 70 works from Arabic into Latin. His output was staggering, encompassing everything from Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which would become the standard medical textbook in Europe for centuries, to fundamental texts on philosophy, mathematics, and optics. How did this translation factory actually work on the ground? The process was a marvel of organized collaboration. A typical team in the Toledo school would begin with a native Arabic speaker, often a Jewish or Muslim scholar. This person would sit with the original manuscript and read the text aloud, translating it phrase by phrase into the local vernacular, which was often Castilian Spanish. A Christian scholar, a master of formal Latin, would then listen to this spoken translation and immediately render it into elegant, scholarly Latin, writing it down. This oral chain allowed for immediate clarification and debate, ensuring the final product was both accurate and readable. The impact of this organized effort was nothing short of revolutionary. It was not merely about adding a few new books to European libraries. This mass transfer effectively moved the entire foundation of Greco-Arabic science, philosophy, and medicine into Latin, the universal language of European universities. Suddenly, scholars in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna had access to a complete and sophisticated scientific tradition they never knew existed. They were confronted with the rigorous logic of Aristotle, the advanced mathematics of Al-Khwarizmi, and the complex medical theories of Avicenna. This influx did not just add to their knowledge, it fundamentally shattered and then rebuilt their entire understanding of the natural world. The scale and organization of the Toledo effort marked the absolute peak of the hidden networks, proving that their work could change the course of civilization. But this massive injection of new ideas created a new problem for the established order in Europe. How would the guardians of traditional learning react when confronted with a tidal wave of foreign knowledge that challenged everything they thought they knew? Within this sprawling web of translators, one group possessed a unique and almost magical key. Jewish scholars, a diaspora community living at the crossroads of civilizations, became the era's ultimate cultural and linguistic mediators. Their daily lives were a constant exercise in translation. In the vibrant markets of Al-Andalus, a Jewish merchant might converse fluently in Arabic with a Muslim official, debate a point of philosophy in Hebrew with a rabbi, and then close a deal using the local Romance tongue with a Christian neighbor. This multilingual reality was not just a practical skill, it was a survival mechanism that made them indispensable to the entire knowledge project. They were the human glue that held the network together, able to navigate the subtle cultural nuances that could make or break a translation. Consider the remarkable Ibn Tibbon family, a true dynasty of translators working in the south of France, in Provence. For generations, they treated the transfer of knowledge as a family business, passing down not just language skills but a profound respect for the integrity of the texts. Judah ibn Tibbon, the patriarch, famously instructed his son, Samuel, to treat his books as his highest treasures. Samuel ibn Tibbon would later undertake one of the most significant translation projects of the age, rendering the monumental work of the Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides from Arabic into Hebrew. His work showcases the layered methodology these scholars perfected. Maimonides himself had written his guide for the perplexed in Arabic, using the Arabic script to make complex Aristotelian philosophy accessible to the widespread Jewish communities living under Muslim rule. But for Jews in Christian Europe who no longer read Arabic, this vital text was locked away. Samuel ibn Tibbon's Hebrew translation did more than just make the book readable. It created an entirely new vocabulary for philosophical discourse in Hebrew, enriching the language itself. This process of translating from Arabic into Hebrew first was a critical and often overlooked step. It was not a detour but a vital filtering stage. Hebrew became a new intermediary language, a clean room where complex ideas from the Arabic intellectual world could be carefully examined, debated, and refined by Jewish scholars before being presented to a wider Latin reading audience. This created a rich and sophisticated Hebrew scientific literature that stood as a major achievement in its own right. The texts they specialized in were at the very cutting edge of thought, philosophy that wrestled with faith and reason, astronomy that mapped the heavens, and medicine that sought to heal the body. Their work ensured that these ideas were not crudely transplanted, but carefully acclimated, their deepest meanings preserved through multiple layers of understanding. The entire network relied on this very multiculturalism, on the existence of polyglot individuals who could think in several languages at once. Without these cultural and linguistic diplomats, the flow of knowledge would have been a shallow stream, lacking the depth and precision that truly transformed a civilization. Their story raises a profound question. How does a society treat the translators in its midst? The people who hold the keys to worlds beyond its immediate horizon. Behind every perfectly translated manuscript lay a hidden technology, a set of tools just as revolutionary as the ideas they helped to convey. These were the bilingual dictionaries, specialized glossaries, and translation manuals, painstakingly compiled over generations. They were not mere word lists, they were the shared operating system for the entire network, the protocols that allowed a scholar in Baghdad and a monk in Cologne to work on the same intellectual project centuries apart. Without them, translating a complex text would have been like building a cathedral with no standard measurements. Consider a translator in Toledo, hunched over a copy of an Arabic philosophical text. He reaches not for a simple vocabulary aid, but for a thick, newly compiled Arabic-Latin glossary dedicated solely to philosophical terms. This volume was itself a monumental intellectual achievement, the result of another scholar's lifetime of work comparing texts, debating meanings, and selecting the most precise Latin equivalent for an abstract Arabic concept. It ensured that when 10 different translators encountered the same crucial term, they all rendered it the same way, creating a coherent and unified body of knowledge in Latin rather than a chaotic jumble of conflicting interpretations. These tools evolved dramatically over time. The earliest versions were indeed simple word lists, but they soon grew into sophisticated resources that included definitions, contextual examples of usage, and even scholarly commentary explaining why one translation was chosen over another. For particularly thorny concepts like specific Greek philosophical terms or unique Arabic mathematical notations, translation manuals began to circulate. These guides offered standardized approaches, providing a kind of intellectual scaffolding for the most difficult translational climbs. They explained how to handle metaphors, how to translate poetic expressions into logical arguments, and how to bridge conceptual gaps between cultures that had no direct equivalent for a certain idea. This development marked a profound shift. It moved translation from an ad hoc, individual craft towards a systematic, cumulative science. A translator was no longer starting from scratch with every new text. He was building upon the collective labor of his predecessors, refining their work and adding his own insights for the next generation. These dictionaries and manuals were the physical embodiment of the network's collective intelligence. They transformed the act of translation from mere transmission into true transformation, ensuring that the soul of the knowledge was not lost in transit. This shared software enabled the network to scale up, creating a coherent intellectual legacy that could withstand the test of time and geography. But once this newly translated knowledge was set loose in Europe, it would collide with the continent's most powerful and entrenched institution. How would the established guardians of tradition react when their entire worldview was challenged by this incoming tide of foreign ideas? A translator in Baghdad, faced with a page of Aristotle, confronted a problem far deeper than vocabulary. He was staring into a conceptual abyss. How do you translate a word for a thing that does not exist in your own culture's way of thinking? The Greek term auger, central to all of Aristotle's philosophy, had no simple counterpart in Arabic. It could mean being or essence or substance. Each choice would send the entire philosophical system spinning in a different direction. This was the true, monumental task, moving entire frameworks of thought across a chasm of language and culture. Translators like Al-Kindi did not just pick a word. They became philosophers in their own right, debating, testing, and sometimes inventing new terms to carry the weight of these alien concepts. The Arabic Johar was eventually chosen for substance, a term that would itself travel for centuries, shaping metaphysical debates from Córdoba to Paris. This was not a simple act of substitution, it was an act of intellectual creation. The challenge did not end with a single perfect word. To make these foreign ideas comprehensible, translators began weaving their own understanding directly into the text. They added extensive commentaries, long explanatory glosses that ran in the margins or between the lines of the original. A student in 12th century Toledo reading a Latin version of an Arabic commentary on an Aristotle translated from Greek was not getting a pure dose of the original. He was entering a conversation that spanned 500 years and 3 continents. The translator was his guide, pointing out difficult passages, explaining cultural context, and reconciling this new philosophy with the reader's own religious and intellectual traditions. This practice transformed the translator from a passive conduit into an active teacher and interpreter. Their voice became part of the canonical text itself. This power to interpret inevitably sparked philosophical debates about the very nature of their work. Should a translation be slavishly literal, preserving every word even if it made the text incomprehensible? Or should it capture the spirit and intention of the author, even if that required some creative liberty to make the idea resonate in a new land? This tension between literal fidelity and cultural fluency was a constant struggle. A too literal translation could render a beautiful poetic metaphor as nonsensical gibberish, but a translation that was too free might inadvertently inject the translator's own biases, subtly steering an entire field of study in a new direction. The transformation of global knowledge happened right here in these thousands of nuanced choices. When a concept from Indian mathematics was filtered through Arabic and then into Latin, it was not the same concept anymore. It was a hybrid enriched by its journey, adapted to new questions and new ways of seeing the world. The translator was a creative artist, and their medium was meaning itself. Every choice of a word was a quiet act of world-building. So what happened when this newly built world, this synthesized and translated knowledge, finally reached the powerful universities of Europe and confronted a system deeply resistant to change? The quiet scratching of quills and the long journeys of scholars were not funded by good intentions alone. They required a powerful engine, a steady flow of gold and silver that turned intellectual curiosity into a sustained, civilization-altering project. This was the world of patronage, where the ambitions of kings, caliphs, and bishops directly shaped the very knowledge that would survive. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphs treated the House of Wisdom as a state-funded department of power. For a ruler like Al-Mamun, sponsoring the translation of Greek philosophy and Persian astronomy was a strategic investment. It bolstered his prestige, demonstrating that his court was the unrivaled center of the world's wisdom, and it provided his empire with the practical tools for better medicine, more accurate calendars, and advanced engineering. This was centralized, top-down patronage on a grand scale, where the intellectual agenda was set by the throne itself. Centuries later in Europe, a different model emerged. Here, ecclesiastical patrons, bishops, and powerful abbots stepped into the role. Archbishop Raymond of Toledo did not fund his translation school out of mere curiosity. He was driven by a complex mix of religious duty, a desire to strengthen the Church's intellectual arsenal, and the practical needs of governing a newly reconquered, multicultural city. His patronage ensured that teams of scholars had the security and resources to work systematically, funneling Arabic knowledge into Latin, but not all patrons were emperors or clerics. In the rising city-states of Italy, wealthy merchant families and private citizens began to commission translations, seeking the prestige that came with being seen as a cultivator of the arts and sciences. This decentralized, competitive patronage created new hubs of activity, diversifying the kinds of texts that were deemed valuable. Perhaps no patron better exemplifies the blend of motives than Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor who ruled from Sicily. A man of fierce intellectual curiosity, he surrounded himself with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars. He directly commissioned translations of Arabic works on falconry, philosophy, and mathematics. For Frederick, knowledge was a direct instrument of power. Understanding Aristotle's logic strengthened his administration, while advanced texts on hunting refined a courtly pursuit that symbolized his authority. His patronage was personal, specific, and deeply pragmatic. The flow of money, therefore, acted as a direct control valve on the pipeline of knowledge. When a patron needed better astronomical tables to navigate the seas for trade or warfare, a flurry of translation activity in astronomy would follow. When the Church required sophisticated philosophical arguments to counter heresies, the works of Aristotle and his Arabic commentators were prioritized. The entire network, for all its intellectual independence, was ultimately steered by the economic and political priorities of its benefactors. They decided which doors in the great library of world knowledge would be unlocked and which would remain sealed shut. This intricate dance between scholar and patron raises a final, crucial question. Once this knowledge was translated, funded, and released into the world, how did it break free from the control of the powerful and become a truly public force that anyone could use, challenge, and build upon? The survival of Aristotle's voice is a story of near loss and improbable recovery. By the early Middle Ages, the direct light of Greek learning had faded in Western Europe. Knowledge of the Greek language itself became a rare and dying art, confined to a few isolated pockets in Italy and Sicily. As the great libraries of the Roman world crumbled into dust, the original manuscripts of foundational thinkers began to vanish. The papyrus they were written on was fragile, and without constant recopying, the texts simply decayed, were lost in wars, or were discarded as irrelevant pagan relics. For centuries, Europe lived in a kind of intellectual amnesia, unaware that it had forgotten the very foundations of logic and natural philosophy. Yet, across the Mediterranean, those same foundational texts were not just surviving, they were thriving. The Arabic translations produced in Baghdad and later in Al-Andalus became, for many works, the only copies left in the entire world. The original Greek versions had disappeared completely. This created a profound and almost unbelievable situation. The works of Aristotle, the very bedrock of Western thought, would have to be reintroduced to the West through the filter of the Arabic language. When a scholar like Gerard of Cremona in Toledo translated Aristotle's posterior analytics from Arabic into Latin, he was not just making a copy. He was resurrecting a ghost, pulling a core text of logic back from the brink of permanent extinction. This was not an isolated case. The brilliant mathematical treatises of Archimedes, detailing his work on geometry and buoyancy, were lost in Greek for over 1,000 years. Their survival hinged on a single Arabic translation, which itself was later translated into Latin, allowing Archimedes' genius to finally re-enter the European mind. The medical corpus of Galen, the ancient world's greatest physician, met a similar fate. His sprawling, systematic works on anatomy and treatment were preserved almost entirely in Arabic, forming the basis for the advanced medical practice that translators like Constantine the African then brought to Europe. This led to the strange and vital process of retranslation. European scholars, desperate for this knowledge, would take the Arabic versions and laboriously convert them back into Latin. In many cases, these scholars had no idea that the text they held in Arabic was itself a translation. They credited the wisdom to the Arabic commentators, unaware they were actually restoring the voice of Aristotle or Archimedes to a world that had long since forgotten it. This phenomenon reveals the hidden network's most vital function. It was not merely a library, but a global backup system for human knowledge. While one civilization suffered a cultural catastrophe, another was diligently preserving the very treasures being lost. The translators, working in their scriptoria and translation schools, were performing a quiet, continuous act of rescue across generations. The fact that we can read these foundational works today is not a historical accident. It is the direct result of this centuries-long chain of custody, a testament to the success of a system that ensured no single point of failure could erase humanity's collective intellect. A single medical idea could save a life, and the network of translators ensured that the best ideas traveled furthest. The journey of medical knowledge is perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this system at work. It begins with the ancient Greek physician Galen, whose theories on anatomy and humors dominated the Roman world. But when Rome fell, Galen's original Greek texts began to vanish from Europe, crumbling into dust and obscurity. His legacy, however, was far from dead. Arabic physicians like Al-Razi, known in the West as Razes, and the brilliant Ibn Sina, whom Europe would call Avicenna, did not merely preserve these Greek works. They absorbed them, debated them, and tested them against centuries of clinical observation and their own discoveries. They transformed a static ancient tradition into a vibrant, living science. The pinnacle of this synthesis was Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. This was not just a book, it was an entire medical universe in 5 volumes, composed in Arabic in Persia around the year 1020. It systematically organized everything from human anatomy and disease definitions to complex pharmacology and surgical procedures. It integrated the theoretical framework of Galen with the practical innovations of Arabic medicine, creating a unified and logical system that a student could actually learn from. This monumental text then embarked on its own epic journey. It traveled from Persia to the libraries of Al-Andalus, where, in the bustling translation hub of Toledo, Gerard of Cremona encountered it. Recognizing its immense value, he dedicated himself to rendering its dense Arabic into clear Latin. His translation was a masterpiece in itself, capturing the nuance and authority of the original. Once in Latin, the canon did not sit on a shelf. It exploded across Europe, becoming the foundational textbook for the newly emerging universities in places like Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris. For over 500 years, this book, which had been synthesized from Greek and Arabic sources 1,000 miles away, was the core of a European doctor's education. A medical student in 15th century Paris would be taught from the same systematic text that a scholar in 11th century Baghdad had studied. But why was the canon so revolutionary? It wasn't just a collection of old facts. It presented medicine as a coherent, logical science. It began with general principles of health and disease, then moved systematically through the body, detailing the symptoms and treatments for every known ailment. Its section on pharmacology listed over 700 drugs with precise instructions on their preparation and use. It introduced the concept of clinical trials, the importance of diet and environment, and the idea of quarantining the sick to prevent the spread of disease. This was a complete operating system for medicine, and it gave European physicians a shared language and a common method. The network did not just move Galen's words from Greek to Arabic to Latin. It built something entirely new upon that foundation. The canon of medicine became something greater than the sum of its parts, a hybrid intellectual creation that directly shaped how an entire civilization understood health, sickness, and the human body for half a millennium. The quiet work of translators in Toledo had put a powerful new tool into the hands of every European doctor, fundamentally altering the practice of healing itself. Mathematics was about to break free from its geometric chains. While Europe still calculated with Roman numerals, a mathematical revolution was quietly unfolding in the East, a revolution built on the power of abstraction. In the vibrant intellectual centers of India and the Arab world, scholars had moved beyond measuring fields and building arches. They were inventing entirely new ways to think about numbers themselves. Indian mathematicians had perfected a decimal place value system, including the revolutionary concept of zero, a symbol for nothing that made calculating everything infinitely easier. This knowledge traveled west, where in 9th century Baghdad, the scholar Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi synthesized these Indian advances with Greek and Persian traditions. His most famous work, written in Arabic, was Hisab al-Jabr al-Muqabala, a title that would echo for centuries. The book's journey to the West began in the translation hubs of Al-Andalus and Toledo. There, Christian and Jewish scholars, working side by side, rendered its dense Arabic into Latin. They translated the title's key phrase, Al-Jabr, which literally means the restoration or the completion, referring to the process of moving subtracted terms to the other side of an equation. This single Arabic word, Al-Jabr, entered Latin as algebra. At the same time, the author's own name, Al-Khwarizmi, was Latinized. It became algorithmy, and from that we derived our modern term algorithm. But this was far more than a simple change of labels. It was the importation of a new mental universe. Before this, mathematics in Europe was predominantly geometric. Problems were solved by drawing shapes and proving theorems with diagrams, a process tied to the physical world. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra was something radically different. It was a science of abstract symbols. He used words, not letters, to represent unknown quantities, laying out systematic procedures for solving linear and quadratic equations. He taught a method where you could manipulate these symbols according to set rules, a step-by-step procedure, an algorithm, to find an answer without ever drawing a single line. Can you grasp the sheer power of that shift? It moved mathematics from the concrete to the abstract, from measuring specific plots of land to solving universal problems. A scholar could now write down a general equation that represented every problem of its kind. This was the birth of a language powerful enough to describe the fundamental laws of the universe. The translation of this single text provided European thinkers with the essential tools for calculus, physics, and engineering. It was a quiet revolution in problem solving, a new set of intellectual keys forged in the East, polished in Spain, and delivered to a world ready to unlock the secrets of nature. A European sailor staring at the stars in the year 1100 knew he was lost. He navigated by inherited folklore and crude dead reckoning, his voyage a gamble against a vast, featureless ocean. The sophisticated celestial models that could guide him safely to distant shores existed only in Arabic, locked away in libraries a continent away. The translation of astronomy was not an academic exercise, it was a race to conquer physical space. Before this knowledge arrived, European astronomy was a patchwork of outdated Roman summaries and biblical chronology, unable to predict planetary movements with any real accuracy. This all changed with the recovery of Ptolemy's Almagest. This monumental 2nd century work, which mapped the heavens with a complex system of epicycles and deferents, had been entirely lost in the West. Its survival depended entirely on its Arabic translation, which scholars in Toledo then rendered into Latin. But the translators did more than just resurrect an ancient text, they delivered its living, updated application. The true navigational breakthrough came in the form of the Toledo tables. These were not theoretical star charts, they were a working database, a set of astronomical calculations painstakingly compiled by Arabic astronomers in the 11th century. They provided precise data on the positions of the sun, moon, and planets for any given date, along with instructions for using this data on specific instruments. Translating these tables was a technical marvel. Teams of scholars had to verify every calculation, ensuring that the Arabic numerals and trigonometric functions were perfectly understood and correctly transcribed. Then came the crucial step of adaptation. The original tables were calculated for the latitude of Toledo. For a sailor in the English Channel or the Mediterranean, these numbers were useless without adjustment. European mathematicians, now armed with the translated methods, began the laborious process of recalculating the entire dataset for the latitudes of Lisbon, London, and Genoa. This was the network transferring not just information, but a fully functional toolkit. The most vital piece of hardware was the astrolabe, a sophisticated analog computer for solving problems relating to time and the position of celestial bodies. Arabic craftsmen and scholars had refined this device to a high art, and its design and usage manuals flooded into Europe through translation. A ship's captain could now hold the polished brass instrument up to the sky, measure the angle of the sun or a specific star above the horizon, and then consult his newly translated and adapted tables to determine his exact latitude at sea. This combination of precise data and sophisticated instrumentation shrank the terrifying expanse of the ocean into a measurable grid. The courage to sail into the unknown was suddenly backed by a reliable mathematical certainty. This direct, practical application of translated knowledge did not just improve trade in the Mediterranean. It built the intellectual foundation for the voyages of Da Gama, Columbus, and Magellan. The age of exploration was funded by gold and ambition, but it was navigated by the stars using charts and tools delivered by a hidden network of multilingual scholars. The world was being connected not by empires first, but by ideas. The quiet logic of the translator's quill was about to ignite a firestorm in the heart of Europe's universities. For centuries, theology had reigned supreme in these halls, its truths rooted in divine revelation and the authority of the Church Fathers. The curriculum was a carefully guarded fortress of faith. Then the floodgates opened. A torrent of new Latin texts arrived, bearing the name of a long-dead pagan philosopher, Aristotle. This was not the fragmented, simple Aristotle they knew. This was the complete system, his entire corpus on physics, metaphysics, ethics, and the natural world, all meticulously translated from Arabic commentaries. Here was a comprehensive, rational, and breathtakingly coherent system for understanding everything from the motion of stars to the nature of the soul, built on logic and observation, not scripture. The effect was an intellectual earthquake. A young student in Paris, trained to accept truth on authority, now encountered a philosophy that argued the world was eternal, that the soul might be mortal, and that truth could be found through reason alone. This directly challenged the core of Christian teaching on creation, immortality, and divine grace. The initial reaction from the church establishment was panic and prohibition. Authorities in Paris and Oxford issued official bans, forbidding the teaching of Aristotle's natural philosophy on pain of excommunication. They saw it as a viral, pagan threat that could corrupt the entire student body. But you cannot unread a revolutionary idea. The bans failed. The new Aristotle was too powerful, too compelling, too useful. His logical methods provided tools for debate and analysis that the old curriculum lacked entirely. A crisis was born, pitting faith against reason in a battle for the medieval mind. The resolution did not come from suppression, but from a breathtaking act of synthesis. A young Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas stepped into this fray. He saw not an enemy in Aristotle, but a partner. Aquinas embarked on a monumental project, writing his Summa Theologica. His method was revolutionary. He would begin each article with a question, then present objections drawn directly from Aristotelian philosophy, followed by a sed contra, or on the contrary, often quoting other authorities. Only then would he offer his own resolution, skillfully weaving Aristotelian concepts like the unmoved mover and the four causes into the fabric of Christian doctrine. He argued that reason and faith were two different paths leading to the same ultimate truth, God. This fusion, known as scholasticism, became the new intellectual foundation for the West. The translators had not merely provided new books, they had delivered a new mental operating system. They gave Europe the very architecture of argument, the method of questioning and logical proof that would define university education for centuries. The network's greatest impact was forcing this profound conversation, a confrontation that did not destroy faith, but ultimately deepened it by demanding it engage with the power of the human mind. Yet this great river of knowledge did not flow through a neutral channel. The translators themselves were not transparent windows. They were human beings shaped by their own faiths, their own cultures, and their own philosophical loyalties. This meant the transfer of ideas was never a perfect, lossless process. It was a process of filtration where certain concepts were softened, omitted, or subtly reshaped to fit the prevailing worldview of the new audience. A translator in a medieval monastery, holding a manuscript by the pagan Aristotle, faced a profound moral and intellectual dilemma. How could he render a passage where the philosopher argued for the eternal nature of the world, a direct contradiction to the Christian doctrine of divine creation from nothing? The choice was stark. A perfectly literal translation could be seen as heresy, threatening the translator's own standing and the acceptance of the entire work. Often, the solution was a quiet act of censorship. The offending passage might be watered down with careful phrasing, or an explanatory note would be added to frame it as a pagan error. In some cases, it was simply left out altogether. The same filtering occurred in the Islamic world. Translators working under the Abbasid Caliphs might hesitate when encountering Greek texts that described multiple gods or depicted the divine in crudely human terms, ideas incompatible with the strict monotheism of Islam. They, too, would employ strategic omissions or reinterpretive glosses to make the ancient wisdom palatable and safe for their own society. Beyond these deliberate edits lay a more subtle form of distortion, cultural bias. A translator's own intellectual framework acted as a powerful lens. Consider an Arabic scholar encountering a sophisticated Indian mathematical concept. He would instinctively interpret it through the vocabulary and philosophical preoccupations of his own Arabic scientific tradition. The original Indian context, the specific problem the concept was designed to solve, might be lost. The idea would be absorbed, but it would also be transformed, taking on new shades of meaning from its Arabic intermediary. It was like a story told through a chain of whispers, the core narrative surviving, but its details and emphasis shifting with each new teller. This human element meant the network was not just a pipeline for knowledge, it was also a refinery and sometimes a censor's office. The body of learning that finally reached Europe was not the raw, unfiltered wisdom of the ancients. It was a curated collection shaped by centuries of selective interpretation. The very act of translation is an act of power, deciding which ideas are important enough to carry across and in what form they will arrive. This critical perspective does not diminish the translator's monumental achievement. Instead, it reveals its true nature. The preservation of global knowledge was not a sterile, mechanical process. It was a deeply human endeavor, messy and imperfect, reflecting all the brilliance and all the biases of the people who made it possible. Every translation began as a physical object, a fragile manuscript hidden away in a collection. Beyond the legendary House of Wisdom lay a shadow world of private libraries, the true caches of intellectual fuel. These were not public institutions but closely guarded treasures belonging to caliphs, bishops, and wealthy merchants. Access to these collections was a form of immense power and a closely held privilege. An invitation to study within a patron's library was a career-defining opportunity for a scholar, granting him entry to a world of texts unavailable anywhere else. The process of building such a library was itself a secretive art. Agents scoured the known world, purchasing rare codices from distant monasteries, accepting precious manuscripts as diplomatic gifts, or commissioning expensive copies from rival collections. A shadowy, unofficial trade in books flourished along the same routes as spices and silks, where a single, rare text could command a king's ransom. Consider the legendary library of the Fatimid caliphs in Cairo, a collection so vast it required a catalogue spanning multiple volumes just to track its contents. It was said to house tens of thousands of volumes, including unique copies of Greek philosophical works and advanced Arabic scientific treatises that existed nowhere else. This was not a library for the public, but a private tool of statecraft and a symbol of dynastic prestige, its contents carefully curated to bolster the intellectual authority of the rulers. In Europe, a scholar like Gerard of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II, understood this power intimately. He ventured into the multicultural environment of Catalonia and secretly acquired Arabic mathematical texts, mastering the use of the astrolabe and introducing Hindu-Arabic numerals to a Europe still struggling with Roman numerals. His private study of these forbidden texts, hidden from the view of his contemporaries, gave him a reputation for almost magical knowledge. The very composition of these collections acted as a filter for the entire network. A library focused on medicine, like that of a ruling family in Sicily, meant that medical texts were prioritized for translation. A bishop's collection strong in philosophy directed scholarly effort toward Aristotle and his commentators. The ideas that flowed across continents did not do so randomly. They traveled along channels dug by the specific tastes, obsessions, and political needs of the individuals who owned the books. The survival of knowledge hinged on these material conditions, on the ink, parchment, and velvet-lined chests in private chambers, where the fate of entire disciplines was decided long before a translator ever picked up his pen. The intellectual dam had finally broken. For centuries, the hidden networks of translators had been channeling a steady stream of recovered knowledge into Europe. The Renaissance was not a sudden miracle springing from barren soil. It was the spectacular bloom after this long, deliberate irrigation. The so-called rebirth was built directly upon the vast library of texts those multilingual scholars had painstakingly assembled. When a humanist scholar in 15th century Florence opened a newly printed book, they were holding the culmination of a process that began in a Baghdad translation house 500 years earlier. The raw materials for their revolution, the complete works of Plato, the precise geometry of Euclid, the brilliant mechanics of Archimedes, had all been saved from oblivion and delivered to them, often through the essential filter of Arabic commentary. These were not sterile artifacts, but living ideas, enriched by the layers of interpretation from philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes. The humanists were not starting from scratch, they were entering a conversation that had been raging across continents for generations. This expanded library fundamentally shifted their understanding of the classical past. It was no longer a lost golden age, but a tangible intellectual inheritance, a treasure chest of thought they could now study, debate, and emulate. This access created an insatiable hunger for the original sources. The mastery of Greek became the central, defining goal of humanist scholarship, not because they rejected the translated legacy, but because they wanted to engage with Plato and Aristotle directly, to peel back the layers and touch the source itself. This drive led to a new wave of translation, but this time from the original Greek into a more elegant Latin and even into vernacular languages. The work of the medieval networks had created the essential precondition, a critical mass of knowledge that made the very idea of a Renaissance possible. They were the indispensable bridge, the quiet builders who laid the foundations upon which Michelangelo would sculpt, Copernicus would calculate, and Da Vinci would dream. The translators did not just preserve books, they preserved the very possibility of a future Renaissance. The story of a single book can reveal the entire network in motion. Take the fables of Caliph and Dimna, a collection of animal tales where jackals and lions debate the nature of power and friendship. Its journey began in ancient India, composed in Sanskrit as the Panchatantra, a manual on statecraft disguised as charming stories for princes. A Persian royal physician, recognizing its profound wisdom, translated it into Pahlavi, the court language of the Sasanian Empire. This was the first great leap, moving the text from its original cultural soil into the world of Persian kings and administrators. The network was already at work, then came its most pivotal transformation. In 8th century Baghdad, a brilliant writer and secretary named Ibn al-Mukaffar rendered the Pahlavi version into a masterpiece of Arabic prose. He did not merely translate the words, he rewrote the text, infusing it with the elegance and philosophical depth prized by Abbasid high culture. He added a new introduction and tailored the moral lessons to resonate with an Islamic audience, turning a foreign book of fables into a central text of Arabic literature. From this new Arabic standard, the stories exploded across the map. Christian scholars translated it into Syriac. Jewish thinkers rendered it into Hebrew, often adding their own layers of commentary. In Toledo, it was translated into Old Spanish and then into Latin, entering the bloodstream of European folklore. At every single stop, the translators acted as creative partners. A Syriac version might emphasize a particular parable about humility, while a Hebrew commentary could explore its ethical dimensions in light of Jewish law. The Latin translation framed the tales as lessons for Christian rulers. The book itself became a living entity, accumulating layers of meaning like a tree adding rings. It was no longer an Indian text or a Persian one, it was a global citizen. The journey of Caliph and Dimna proves that the network did not just carry science and philosophy. It transmitted a whole way of thinking through story, a practical wisdom that taught generations how to live, how to rule, and how to survive. This one book, through its endless adaptations, became a mirror of the entire system, multicultural, adaptable, and endlessly generative, transforming the imaginative landscape of every culture it touched. Every single manuscript was a unique and irreplaceable artifact. The entire global network of knowledge rested on a foundation of fragile parchment and papyrus, vulnerable to a single spark or a patch of dampness. To produce just one copy of a major work like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine required a staggering investment of time, labor, and wealth. A skilled scribe might spend an entire year on the task, carefully curing the animal skins for parchment, mixing expensive inks, and copying each letter by hand in a dimly lit scriptorium. The cost was astronomical, equivalent to the price of a small farm, making books among the most valuable objects in the medieval world. This immense value was matched only by their profound fragility. A library was a tinderbox waiting for a flame. A sudden fire in a monastery, a burst water pipe in a Baghdad mansion, or the sack of a city by invading armies could erase centuries of accumulated learning in an afternoon. The eventual destruction of the House of Wisdom itself serves as the ultimate cautionary tale. While the exact circumstances are shrouded in legend, Its dissolution represented a catastrophic severing of links in the global network. Unique translations, original commentaries, and foundational texts vanished forever, creating gaps in our understanding that can never be filled. Even when a manuscript survived, it faced a more subtle and insidious threat, the slow corruption of its own message. This was the danger of textual drift. Every time a new copy was made, small errors inevitably crept in. A tired scribe might skip a line, mishear a word read aloud, or guess at a faded letter. One copy might have a crucial not omitted from a philosophical statement, completely reversing its meaning. Another might misplace a decimal point in a mathematical table, rendering it useless for navigation. With each new generation of copies, these tiny mistakes multiplied and compounded. Like a whispered secret passed through a long chain of people. A text could drift so far from its original meaning that it became nonsensical or even dangerously misleading. The only defense against this creeping decay was the meticulous work of the translators and scholars who acted as the network's editors. A master translator like Hunayn ibn Ishaq did not just work from one manuscript. He would seek out multiple copies, often traveling great distances to compare different versions line by line, hunting for discrepancies. He was not just moving words from one language to another, he was performing textual archaeology, digging through layers of scribble errors to reconstruct the author's original intent. This constant, vigilant effort was the immune system of the knowledge network, fighting a continuous battle against entropy. The survival of Aristotle's logic, or Al-Khwarizmi's algebra, was never a foregone conclusion. It was a victory snatched from the jaws of oblivion, a testament to the stubborn dedication of countless individuals who chose to pick up a pen, despite the overwhelming odds, and carefully copy the light forward into the next generation. The historical record casts a long shadow, but if you listen closely, you can hear the quiet influence of women shaping this grand narrative of knowledge. While the names of female translators are largely lost to us, their power operated through different, equally vital channels, as patrons, scholars, and facilitators within their own households. Consider the Byzantine Princess Anna Komnene, a formidable historian and intellectual in her own right. After her father's death, she retreated from political life and gathered a circle of philosophers and scholars around her, actively patronizing their work and contributing to a major history of her era. She was not an isolated figure. Across the Mediterranean, noble women in the courts of Italy and Spain used their wealth and social standing to become crucial engines of the translation movement. They sponsored the work of scholars, offering financial security and the protection of their great houses, and their private libraries often became informal centers for intellectual exchange. What ideas were debated in these salons, in the more intimate, female-dominated spaces of a castle or a villa? These were environments where a visiting scholar might first present a new translation, where the merits of an Arabic medical text or an Aristotelian argument could be discussed freely, away from the formal rigidity of a university or a monastery scriptorium. The education these aristocratic women received, often in languages, music, and philosophy, equipped them to be discerning patrons. They could evaluate the quality of a translation, understand the significance of a recovered text, and direct their resources toward projects they found meaningful. Their influence was a soft, pervasive force, guiding the intellectual currents of their time by deciding which scholars to support and which books to acquire. To overlook their role is to see only half the network in action. The transmission of knowledge was not solely the work of lone, male scholars traveling dusty roads. It was also nurtured in the quiet courts and cultivated salons where women held the keys to the resources and the social connections that made the entire endeavor possible. This more complete picture reveals a system that thrived precisely because it drew upon the intellect and influence of an entire society, not just half of it. Our everyday speech is a living archive of this great migration of ideas. Words we use without a second thought carry hidden journeys from Baghdad to Toledo, their origins fossilized within them. Take the very foundation of modern mathematics, algebra. This word comes directly from the Arabic term al-jabr, which means the restoration or the reunion of broken parts. It was the title of a revolutionary book by the scholar Al-Khwarizmi, whose own name, Latinized, gave us the word algorithm. His text taught a systematic procedure for solving equations, a step-by-step method that is the essence of an algorithm today. Then there is alkali, a cornerstone of chemistry, derived from the Arabic al-kali, meaning the ashes of a specific plant used in soap making. This term entered the scientific lexicon through translated Arabic texts on practical chemistry. Look up at the sky and you are using another gift from these translators. Zenith and nadir are both from Arabic. Zenith comes from Samt al-Raz, meaning the path over the head, while nadir comes from Nathir al-Samt, the opposite path. These astronomical terms were essential for precise celestial navigation and found their way into European languages through star charts and manuals. Even in your kitchen cupboard, you will find the legacy of this network. The word syrup comes from the Arabic sharab, which simply meant a drink. It entered Europe through translated medical texts that prescribed sweet, medicinal concoctions. The concept of an average, so central to statistics and everyday life, has a commercial origin. It comes from the Arabic awariya, meaning damaged goods, which related to the equitable sharing of maritime losses, a practice that evolved into calculating a mean value. The word cipher, meaning zero or code, comes from the Arabic sifr, meaning empty or zero, and perhaps most surprisingly, the common word check, as in a bank check, traces back to the Arabic sak, meaning a written order or a commercial voucher. This term moved through medieval trade routes into Latin as a checkum and into the financial systems of Europe. Each of these words is a tiny time capsule. They are not just borrowed terms, they are the direct footprints of concepts that did not exist in the European mind before the translators did their work. Our language itself is a monument to their invisible collaboration, a daily reminder that the roots of our modern world stretch across continents and cultures, all connected by the quiet, persistent work of moving meaning from one tongue to another. Centuries before the first digital signal, the medieval world had already built its own internet. Those hidden networks of translators and libraries formed a sprawling, organic system for moving information across the globe. Think of a lone translator in a monastery as an early router, receiving a precious packet of data in the form of an Arabic manuscript. His task was to process that information, verify its contents against other copies to check for corruption, and then transmit it onward by translating it into a new language, sending fresh copies to other nodes in the network. These nodes were the servers, the great libraries of Baghdad, Córdoba, and Monte Cassino, where knowledge was stored, catalogued, and made available for access by qualified scholars. This was a decentralized web, resilient precisely because it was not controlled by any single empire. If one node, like the House of Wisdom, went offline, the information survived elsewhere, in Toledo or Palermo, ready to be retrieved and repropagated. The entire system thrived on connectivity, creating a kind of intellectual bandwidth that allowed ideas to flow from India to Spain. This medieval web even had its own version of a common protocol. Just as the modern internet relies on standardized rules like TCP/IP to ensure all devices can communicate, the translation network relied on a universal language, Latin, and later, a shared academic vocabulary. This common protocol meant a scholar in Paris could read a text translated in Oxford and understand it perfectly because the foundational terms meant the same thing. Both systems also faced remarkably similar challenges. The scourge of misinformation is not a modern invention. A medieval scholar worried about scribble errors the way we worry about fake news. A single mistake copied through generations of manuscripts could distort a philosophical argument or ruin an astronomical table. Both networks developed methods to fight this decay, with translators like Hunayn ibn Ishaq acting as human firewalls, cross-referencing multiple sources to filter out errors and maintain data integrity. Censorship was another shared burden. Just as modern platforms grapple with content moderation, medieval patrons and religious authorities decided which texts were safe to translate and circulate. A controversial idea about the eternity of the world might be quietly omitted or heavily annotated with corrective commentary, a form of algorithmic bias applied by human hands. The most powerful parallel, however, lies in the creative potential of both networks. The medieval internet, like our own, did not merely preserve old data. It created powerful new syntheses. Greek logic, filtered through Arabic commentary and Jewish interpretation, emerged in Latin Europe as a revolutionary new tool for thought. This was the open-source software of its day, remixed and improved by countless contributors across centuries. By seeing these scholars as the architects of a pre-digital information age, we recognize their true legacy. They were not just preservers of the past, but the original engineers of global connection, building the conceptual infrastructure for the interconnected world we inhabit.